Hello and welcome to another lecture for Introduction to Psychology. In this lecture we will be doing the second half of developmental psychology. So we will be finishing up the adolescent stuff and going into adulthood and looking at a little bit finishing up with death and dying. So just as a preview of it, we're going to look at, starting with adolescence, going to look at puberty, we're going to look at physical development as well as cognitive and emotional development, look a little bit at morality. Then we'll get into things like parenting styles and identity, and we will finish up with the aging. So let's look at adolescence. So adolescence is one term that's been applied to, or one statement that's been applied to adolescence is that it's a time of storm and stress, meaning that there's a lot going on, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of changes in emotions, changes in behaviors, hormones are just going wild, as we'll talk about in the next few. So adolescence is really a time where a lot is changing and there can be a lot of stress involved as well. What is adolescence though? Now, adolescence is kind of variable. Some people apply adolescence as the teenage years, so the teens, 13 to 19. Some people start adolescence at puberty. Well, as we'll get to when we talk about puberty in a minute, what start of puberty are we talking about? Are we talking about the literal definition of puberty or the classic definition of puberty? We'll get to that in just a minute. And then, as I said, some consider it ending at about 19, but others consider it going until about 21. And that's a age that's kind of important to development that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But why does adolescence go that long? Well, one of the big things we know is that the brain continues developing until about the age of 21 to 22, right in that range. So if we look at adolescence as the time that the brain is undergoing rapid maturation, rapid development, then we need to extend adolescence up until the end of the brain development, which is at about 21, 22. During this time, all kinds of biological, cognitive, social, personality traits, they change from childhood to adult-like. It brings changes in physical features, hormonal activity. It basically allows adolescents to become parents. So along with that becomes the social, physical, emotional changes, all of these that come along with a body going from childlike to adult-like. So we've talked in the previous development slides about how children basically are developing cognitively, socially, physically, all of that, but that's more of just a growth thing. Adolescence is where a individual goes from childlike to adult-like. So let's look at some of the physical development. We're going to start with talking about puberty for a couple slides. We'll talk about puberty in general, then we'll look at girls during puberty, then we'll look at boys during puberty. But puberty in general is classified as about the ages of 7 to 17. Now that 7 you might think is very early, but as I was saying on the previous slide, there's actually two definitions we have of puberty. There's the literal definition and the classical definition. The classical definition is the period of time after a specific incident. So in girls, the classical definition of puberty starts when the girl gets her first period. And with guys, it starts with spermatogenesis, when a guy has his first sperm. But that is only the classical definition. That is not the literal definition of puberty. The literal definition of puberty is basically when hormonal changes start in the body. And these hormonal changes can start as early as 7 to 8. And they occur years before our classical definition of puberty, but it's basically starting to shift the body to get ready for that. So during puberty, there's significant biological changes going on, there's sexual maturation going on, you get the primary sexual characteristics showing up. These are the body structures specific to sex and related specifically to reproduction. So ovaries in girls, testes in boys, and these are these primary sexual characteristics that allow for reproduction. We also have the secondary sex characteristics, which are the physical characteristics other than directly the reproductive organs that differentiate males and females. So hair and pubic hair, facial hair, underarm hair, breasts. In guys, the shoulders get wider. In girls, the hips get wider. Those types of things are what would be classified as the secondary sexual characteristics. And these types of things even start to occur before our classical definition of puberty, but for the most part, these are the things that once our classical definition of puberty, these really kick in. Let's look at girls first. So with girls, we've got this starts at about 9.6 years of age where we get a physical growth. So this physical growth starts younger than, again, our classical definition. Even breast development starts 6 to 12 months later, but still before menarche. So we'll look at menarche real quick. Menarche is the first menstrual period. And what is going on here is estrogen levels are drastically increasing. And what this does is this stimulates the development of both the primary and the secondary sexual characteristics. But again, it should be pointed out that estrogen levels start to increase years before this. It's only at this point that they get a very drastic increase. So again, for girls, you're looking at starting at about 9.6 years of age where physical growth starts. A few years before that for hormonal changes, but then large hormonal changes happen later, typically at about the average age of 12, right in that range. In some it's earlier, in some it's later, but right about the average age of 12, which is very dependent on nutrition, by the way. When I teach developmental, I talk about this more, so I'm not going to really talk about it here, but nutrition plays a very large role on when a girl reaches menarche. Those who are not getting adequate nutrition, or those who are athletic, so they're performing athletics, and as a result their body isn't building up extra quantities of fat, those girls will reach puberty later than girls who are getting a adequate amount of nutrition or even an overabundance of calories. One thing that's related to it is being overweight. Girls that are overweight will reach menarche earlier. So nutrition plays a big role in that average age of starting. That's why it's really just variable. Let's switch to boys. So physical growth and height is actually a little bit later in boys than it is in girls. So about 13 to 14 you get this. So for a period of time, girls will tend to be on average taller and even more like muscular and stronger than boys. And so this is something you see in late childhood, early adolescence, where girls tend to be a bit bigger than boys. And during this time, you get a lot of these various different things that are going on developmentally that result in some sports being co-ed at that point in time that cannot necessarily be co-ed after because of the developmental changes and the sex differences that occur after that. Male sexual maturity includes the growth of the genital organs. It does begin at around the age of 11, continues for approximately 3 years. Sperm production begins at around the age of 12 to 14. This is called androarch or gonadoarch. That's actually two different things, but they're similar enough that for the purposes of this class, we can just stick with that. But that's when sperm production begins, and that is when, again, the classical definition for boys reaching puberty, though even with boys, the hormonal changes start years earlier at around 8, 9, right in that age. We talked about estrogen for girls. Well, testosterone is the major hormone for boys, and this stimulates the growth of the genital organs and the development of the secondary sexual characteristics, including things like sex drive and aggression, other things relating to that. So when we talk about these hormones, testosterone and estrogen, it should be pointed out that both guys and girls have both. But girls have much, much, much higher levels of estrogen, and guys have higher levels of testosterone. I'm not going to say much, much, much higher, because girls have higher levels of testosterone in relation to the levels of estrogen that boys have. But testosterone is responsible for a lot of different things, like aggression, but also sex drive. And we're not going to talk about it in here, but interesting to note that sexual dysfunctions later in life, one way they treat girls for sexual dysfunction is administration of testosterone. Okay, let's look at some of these maturation things that are going on and what it ends up resulting in. So, and we're looking at more of the psychological side now. So girls in adolescence become concerned with appearance. They worry about the responses of others. Boys, on the other hand, are more likely to welcome adolescence. So girls, in some ways, not entirely, but on average, girls more dread adolescence. Boys welcome adolescence, or girls dread puberty. Boys welcome puberty, because boys get weight gain, voice changes, things like that we get as this definition of masculinity, and the boys that are reaching puberty are getting more masculine as a result. It does prompt family changes. Puberty does. Things like physical distancing. So whereas before adolescence there might be hugging, you might kiss your parents, things like that. And adolescents tend to distance yourself from your parents. So that physical distancing occurs. And during this time, teens are becoming more independent and less close to their parents on average, not always, but tending to try to become more independent, become adults. I will point out that this less close to parents tends to, on average, go away in adulthood. So in childhood, kids tend to be really close to their parents. In adolescence, on average, not all, but on average, adolescents tend to be distant from their parents, or more distant, and then in adulthood they become close again to their parents. Let's look at a couple challenges or issues, and that is mainly relating to the advantages and disadvantages of early and late development. So hitting puberty earlier or later. So earlier, later development. So for early development for boys, the advantage is they tend to be judged more socially competent, more attractive, more self-assured. The disadvantage, on the other hand, is they tend to have an increased risk of earlier involvement in substance use, problem behaviors such as bullying, delinquency. Basically, the boys that are hitting puberty earlier tend to hang out with those who are older, and they get the advantages of being part of that older age group or older social group, but they also get the disadvantages that go along with it. So the advantage is, again, socially competent, but the disadvantage, the substance use, substance abuse, things like that. Whereas late development in boys, the advantage is they're less likely to use alcohol, but the disadvantage is they tend to have higher anxiety, less security with themselves, more behavior and adjustment problems, lower achievement and test scores. So if I were to ask you a question, what's better, early or late development for boys? It would be early development. While there are disadvantages, the advantages tend to outweigh them, because late development, the disadvantages outweigh. Now, this isn't talking about normal development, average development. This is just talking about the boys who develop first versus the boys who develop last. So if we broke them down into, let's say, thirds, early would be the first third, late would be the last third. The middle, that second third, the average, we don't really look at advantages and disadvantages there, because that's mainly the norm. Let's switch to girls then. So girls, early development has no real advantages. Did you just see disadvantages here? What's really going on here is there's a whole bunch of disadvantages to early development for females. They might be subject to ridicule by boys that haven't reached puberty. They tend to have higher levels of body dissatisfaction. They start dating earlier. They have earlier sexual activity, higher levels of depression, substance use. Basically, girls who are developing earlier are getting targeted by boys who are older as potential dating partners. Well, that leads to all these potential issues. On the other hand, late development for girls, so that last third, have the disadvantage of some anxiety because they tend to be smaller, things like that, but they tend to have an advantage of good school performance. So ignoring the middle third, the average development, if I asked you what is better, early or late development for females, it would be late development. So early development is better for boys, late development is better for girls. Let's transition into, and I just have it all on the slide at once here, brain development. So one of the big things here with brain development that I come back to, I mentioned a few times and now I'm going to come back to, is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functionings, and really it's the biggest part of development when it comes to cognitive development in humans. It is also the last part of the brain to fully develop. So there's big changes that started around age 11 and continue into young adulthood about 21 plus. During this time, the brain is rewiring and reorganizing itself to work more like an adult. And really, this is where that 21 comes in that I was talking about earlier, because the prefrontal cortex does not finish developing until about 21, 22. And that's why some look at the definition of adolescence as going until that age. What is the prefrontal cortex responsible for? So it's, again, this portion at the front of the brain. What is it responsible for? Executive functioning, which includes things like risk-taking. That's a big one. So it's risk-taking is a big thing that is occurring that the prefrontal cortex controls. This does explain why adolescents do risky and irresponsible behavior more than adults do. So the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed. Adolescents tend to take more risks. Now, if we want to look at this in an evolutionary sense, I love my evolution. In an evolutionary sense, it's actually beneficial for an adolescent to take risks. Because historically, if the adults were established, one thing an adolescent could do to basically gain dominance, gain status, things like that, is take risks. Now, they might lose, and then they don't gain the rewards, and they may even die from it. But if they win their risk, if they take a risk and they succeed at it, then it could increase their status and dominance enough that increases their mating opportunities. So there is a not modern but past evolutionary reason for adolescents to take risks. So it makes a little sense here. But what it does in modern times is it makes adolescents feel invulnerable and have no fear of accidents, things like that. There's a video on the next slide. I'll let you watch that. It talks about risk-taking, and it goes into that a bit more detail.
Despite these new cognitive abilities, adolescents have a tendency to believe that they are invulnerable to risk. They engage in behaviors that have potential negative consequences, but don't believe the negative consequences could actually happen to them.
Drinking and driving. I have to say I've done it before, and it's not always a situation where you absolutely don't have to do it. Sometimes you have to get home, or your ass is in big trouble. Or it's like not like hammered where you can't even stand up straight. You've had about 3 or 4 beers, or 2 mixed drinks or something, and you need to drive. And you might feel a little tipsy, but you have to drive home because the reverse effect is far worse than what might happen to you on the road, because generally you might not get into an accident, but it definitely is a big risk, and it's something that, you know, parents worry about, but teenagers tend not to worry about it because it's not real in their mind until something will actually happen and one of their friends really gets hurt.
Do you think people have unprotected sex?
All the time.
Why?
Because they say it feels better.
Oh, right. But they could die, right? AIDS and stuff?
I don't think they really think about that too much.
Why do you think that is?
Because a lot of teenagers think they're invincible. They think nothing can touch them.
Why?
Because they're stupid.
Oh, everybody's pregnant nowadays. I don't know if anybody's like using condoms anymore, because there's about 5 or 6 people that are walking around the school that are sophomores and juniors that are pregnant.
Oh yeah, what about
And
that?
they're amongst like a lot of, well, all of them that I know of are minorities. So I don't know if people like believe in using condoms anymore or what, birth control or getting a shot or something, but I guess it doesn't exist, because I know 3 people who are pregnant.
3 people who just had a baby.
And 3 people who just had a baby who are like under the ages of
15?
Two
who are
girls
like
in my class
16.
are expecting.
We have at least 6 girls in this school alone.
Why do you think teenagers have unprotected sex when they know that pregnancy or STDs are possibilities or probabilities?
Some guys will tell you, oh, you're going to be my first and all that sort of stuff, and they really like, 'cause you can't really tell if a guy's virgin or not. And then you think that he is your only, he's going to be your first, and if you're with the guy a very long time, you're going to think, oh, he's true to me and stuff like that. And then they'll have unprotected sex thinking they're going to be together forever, and it really don't matter. And some people also get their boyfriend tested, or they go and both get tested.
Really?
And they think, oh, neither one of us have an STD. He's not cheating on me, so we'll be okay.
Why would you, if you know the risk, why would you do that?
Oh, because it's a little saying, oh, it won't happen to me. Like, there are people in here that have caught the diseases, and they're like, oh, I didn't think it would happen to me. But your friends have been telling you, because, like, I knew girls that were, like, going every day and having sex when I was in 7th grade in Cambridge. They were like, oh, yeah, I'm not a virgin. I haven't been a virgin since, like, 4th grade. Yeah, the ages have gotten younger.
Again, interesting stuff. I love the risk-taking and aggression stuff. I've done research on it, and it's one of those things that interests me, and that kind of explains, especially if you go back to that prefrontal cortex, explains some of the reasons adolescents think the way they do. Let's transition real quick. We're going to talk just real quickly, a few slides, but I'm going to go through it quick, about things like moral reasoning. Because development from childhood into adolescence into adulthood changes the way we think about the world morally, changes the way we reason morally. So we've got Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning. There's 3 main levels, each has stages. The lowest level of moral reasoning is stage 1. It's where our decisions are based primarily on fear of punishment and the need to be obedient. So this is early childhood. We act the way we do to avoid punishment and need to be obedient. Stage 2 is guided by satisfying self-interests, which may involve bargaining. This is, again, childhood, but a little bit later in childhood, where it becomes less about directly the punishments and more about self-interests. Then we get into the social approval stage, step 2, and this is where in step 2, or the second level, we get to stage 3, which is moral decisions are guided by confronting the standards of people we value. So this is more of this early adolescence. So we look to those we value, and we guide our decisions based on those we value. And then we get to stage 4 of the second level, and that is we determine moral reasoning by conforming to laws in society. And again, this happens early adolescence, maybe even late childhood age. And this is one of those where you actually see kids who have been riding in a car with their parent since they were born, and let's say the parent always speeds. and the kid has never said anything, and all of a sudden they make comments to their parent about speeding and needing to obey the speed limit, because it becomes more about conforming to laws in society and strict obeying of the laws. Then in the third level, there's 2 stages of this level, but we're not going to talk about stage 6, mainly because basically people don't reach stage 6. Some people do, but it's rare. Stage 5, though, is where moral decisions are now made after carefully thinking about alternatives and striking a balance between human rights and the laws of society. And this is where you get, like, and the video is going to talk about it some in the next slide, but you get the moral dilemma. You know someone who needs medicine to stay alive. You have a relative who needs medicine to stay alive. The pharmacy won't sell it, or you can't afford it. Do you steal the medicine to keep that person alive? It's a moral thing, because if you do, you are going against laws and society. But it is the right thing to do in human rights sense, because you're saving a life. So this is where this level, and you'll see it in the video and how kids think about this, but this level is basically about looking at more than just the law or more than just what our friends think, and now looking at human rights and things like that.
As adolescents begin to think more abstractly and become better able to take another's perspective, they also become better able to consider multiple perspectives and use their own ethical principles when presented with a moral dilemma, moving into what Kohlberg referred to as the post-conventional stage of moral reasoning. When presented with Kohlberg's Heinz dilemma and asked if Heinz should have stolen the drug to save his dying wife, Tim, Lauren, and Alan illustrate these changes in moral reasoning.
I probably would have. I would have done the same thing. If it was like my mother or something, I would have done it. I would have done whatever it takes.
Why?
Because if you care about somebody and you're trying your hardest to do something for them and things get in your way, sometimes you just gotta last resort type thing, steal it, whatever you have to do.
I think it was right. Just
Why?
because, like, because everything in the world comes down to money, and we just over obsess about money. And I'm just like, if you want to help out a fellow human being, I'd rather do that than have just a bunch of paper.
Absolutely. To punish someone because of going above and beyond out of love for somebody, I think goes over the bounds of our understanding.
So if you had to say, was Heinz right or wrong to steal the drug? What would you say?
Oh man, I'd have to say he was right.
So let's talk now about the self. So we talked about the self in childhood and how that changes throughout the ages, and now we're going to look at it in adolescence. So now we're talking about the self-description, self-concepts, things like that. So compared to the children's self-descriptions that we talked about in the last one, which is very categorical, that type of thing, those of adolescents become less physical and more psychological. So the traits they describe themselves as are not about their physical appearance, but about their psychological makeup, become less concrete and more abstract, are more differentiated. So the one thing in childhood is you tend to see that if you ask 10 kids to describe themselves, you'll get a lot of overlap. One may say the same things as others, whereas in adolescence, you get less overlap. The next is they're more integrated and coherent, meaning one part of their self-description ties into other parts, rather than, again, in earlier childhood, they might be just throwing everything out. The way they look, the age they are, their friends, the sports they play, things like that, where they're just all doing all these different things that aren't really integrated, whereas in adolescence, our self-concept and self-description becomes more integrated, and it becomes more self-aware and reflective. So we're more aware of actually who we are and more reflective on that. Self-esteem, though, tends to decrease in adolescence. So between childhood and early adolescence, this transition to middle or junior high school, So there's a school change, the first major school change for a lot of kids. There's the physical changes of puberty. There's social comparisons going on. All of this results in self-esteem lowering on average. Now, that being said, it doesn't lower on everyone, and in some people it lowers more than others. And relating to that specifically, those adolescents with the lowest self-esteem, the ones that tend to have the greatest decrease or just are the lowest in general, as adults they tend to have poorer physical and mental health, poorer career and financial prospects, and higher levels of criminal behavior. So self-esteem in adolescence is pretty important. It's something that should be addressed early if possible. Next thing we're going to talk about is identity. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about identity. We'll look at that and look at the different things that go on with identity, and I'll have a video for you. But if you remember from the previous set of slides, I talked about Erickson and the challenges that Erickson had throughout the lifespan, and the one that was supported was identity. And looking at that, really what is going on here? That is, the quest for identity or the search for identity involves important questions, but it involves basically two main things. And those two main things that you're going to see on the next couple sets of slides is whether an individual has a crisis, whether a crisis challenging that part of their identity. And I should point out that what you see here on this slide, what type of career do I want, religious, moral, political values, who am I as a man or a woman, as a sexual being, where do I fit in the world, things like ethnic identity, what do I really want out of life, sexual identity, all of these are different components of identity. There tends to be overlap between them, but they are different components of identity. So when I talk about these two questions that people face when dealing with identity, it's for each individual or each specific part of identity. So the first is, do they have a crisis or a challenge to that part of their identity? And then the other is, have they made a commitment whether to form a new identity or commitment to form a existing identity, or are they still in a searching type phase? We'll come back to that in a couple slides, but on the next slide is a video on identity I recommend watching.
A major challenge in the development of self occurs during adolescence: the task of forming an identity. The attainment of a strong sense of identity is a process rather than a simple step on the path toward adulthood. The following adolescents, when asked what they have planned for their lives, illustrate significant individual differences in identity development.
I'm trying to achieve my goals, go to the league. I really want to just play that and get that one. All I want is one game in the NFL, just one. I don't care if I get hurt, anything.
I think I want to go pre-med. I think I want to study pre-medicine and eventually become a doctor. But at the same time, I want to spend a semester abroad. I want to do a semester-long community service project in some foreign country. I want to go on those kind of foreign aid projects. I want to spend a semester here, spend a semester there, do this for a semester. I want to minor in law and major in something else. I want to get French. At the same time that I want to slow down and not rush myself, I want to be able to absorb much more so that I can, again, see what I like, see what I don't, and make better choices based on that.
Yes, actually, I've been thinking about it since I think I was 6, and I'm aiming to be on Broadway.
So let's look at those identity statuses. And again, this goes back to those questions, those key questions of whether a crisis or a challenge has been experienced. Basically, what this is saying is, has the individual had to think deeply about that part of their identity? Have they explored alternatives? And one way to look at it, you see it in this example on the right, is looking at a religious identity. So what religion do you practice? What religion do you follow? And you get these questions that come in. So let's first look at, well, let me do the second question first, and that is whether an individual has achieved a commitment to a specific identity, whether they've resolved the questions raised. Now first we're going to look at this, and I'll put a 1 here, in diffusion status. So diffusion status is where neither of these questions have really come up. They haven't faced a challenge and they haven't made a commitment. So the example here when we're talking about religion is, I haven't really thought much about religion, and I guess I don't know what I believe exactly. So it's basically you're going along with what you've done, how your parents raised you, but you really even haven't taken it even that step farther and decided that that is the religion for you. Let's actually look at foreclosure. So there's still no crisis. We've still got no crisis, but now a commitment has been made. So foreclosure, we'll look at it as 2, is where basically you haven't really thought about it, but you have made a decision. And this is where the statement here, my parents are Baptist and I'm a Baptist, it's just the way I grew up. So whereas diffusion is you're doing it, but you really haven't decided on that's what you want to do, but you're just doing it because that's the way it's always been. Foreclosure is where it's the way it's always been, but that's the decision you've made to go with it. And then the third one we're going to look at is moratorium. So moratorium is where a crisis has been experienced. You've got a challenge. So a crisis of faith or challenge, something came up that made you think about your faith, your religion. And again, this works for any type of identity. We're just using religion as an example here. And moratorium is one where you have not made a commitment yet, though. So you're really in moratorium, you're going through a challenge, going through it, but not yet to the point where you've made a decision. So the quote here, I'm in the middle of evaluating my beliefs and hope that I'll be able to figure out what's right for me. I've become skeptical about some of what I have been taught, and I'm looking into other faiths for answers. And then finally 4, we get identity achievement. Identity achievement means you've had a challenge and made a commitment. So a crisis, a challenge has been experienced and you've made a commitment. So the quote here is, I really did some soul searching about my religion and other religions too, and finally know what I believe and what I don't. It should be pointed out here that in identity achievement status, this 4th stage, you can get to the same decision, you can make the same decision you made in foreclosure. So in foreclosure here, the person is Baptist because that's the way they were raised. In identity achievement, they may choose Baptist, but they've gone through a challenge and they've thought more about it, if that makes sense. Or they may decide something entirely different. So it's really identity achievement status, this last one, is about having a challenge, thinking about it deeply, and then making a decision based on that information. And the final thing I'll say is that this isn't a fixed process. This isn't a fixed finish goal. Identity achievement isn't always the end. Some people go from diffusion to foreclosure, and then they end up going to moratorium. So end up going to moratorium from foreclosure. So they may make a decision based on just the way it's always been, but then something later causes a challenge or crisis, and they may go to moratorium from that and then get to identity achievement. And again, they may choose the same thing as in foreclosure, but it may be something caused them to have a challenge or a crisis. And just because you've reached identity status, achievement status, doesn't mean that's the end goal or the end either. Some people go through moratorium, go through a crisis, go through a challenge, make a decision, get to identity achievement, and then they go through another crisis, so they go back to moratorium. And then, of course, after that, they go back to achievement. So it's really not as cut and dry or as clean as this looks, because people can go back and forth between the different phases. But once somebody goes to moratorium, they're really not going to go back to diffusion or foreclosure. But once they go to moratorium, they can go to identity achievement and then back to moratorium or back to achievement. And if they're in foreclosure, they can go to moratorium. There's just, it's not as simple or easy as you face one challenge in your life, make a decision, and you're done. No, we tend to face multiple challenges or crises to various different parts of our identity, and we keep forming our identity throughout adulthood. And that's the last thing that I'll talk about with identity formation here, is we keep forming identity throughout adulthood. People tend to view it as just an adolescent thing, and whereas the biggest changes in formation and identity happens in adolescence, really it does go throughout the entire life after that. You can have changes in identity and really moratorium and identity achievements happening in your 60s, 70s, 80s. It just depends on what part of your identity and what potential challenges have come up. Okay, let's transition now into some parenting styles. I'm going to talk about parenting styles, and then I'm going to go into talking about the adult after that. So really with this is now we are into adulthood in development. So now we're talking about adults, but this is kind of the reason I bring up parenting styles here is because this looks at kind of that overlap between the two. You get the parenting styles that parents use, but you also look at what happens to children who are raised by specific parenting styles. So let's look at these. There's two things that come into play when we're looking at parenting styles. And that is, the first is acceptance responsiveness. So this is basically one of the two things, acceptance responsiveness. And this refers to the extent in which the parents are supportive, sensitive to children's needs, willing to provide affection, praise, things like this. So this includes mainly affection, praise, encouragement. So parents who are high in acceptance responsiveness tend to be high in affection, praise, and encouragement. Those low, so let's look at that, those low in accepting and responsive often criticize, belittle, punish, ignore children, rarely communicate to the children that they're loved or valued, those types of things where there's just low communication. Whereas on the other hand, those high in acceptance responsiveness, also called warm parents, so warm responsive parenting is associated with secure attachments to the parents. So we talked about attachments earlier. Academic competence, high self-esteem, good social skills, pure acceptance, strong sense of morality, all good positive things that come out of parents who are warm and accepting and responsive. That's only the first of the two questions when it comes to parenting style, though, acceptive responsiveness. The other of the two questions is demanding control. Demanding control is basically sometimes looked at as a permissive restrictive spectrum. So demanding this control is what the parents do who are restrictive, but you've got a spectrum between permissive and restrictive. On one end, you've got parents that are really permissive. On the other end, you've got parents that are really restrictive. And what comes down to here is that this is how much control over decision making is in the parents rather than the child. Do the children have some control over the decision making? So controlling and demanding parents, they set rules, they expect their children to follow them, they monitor their children closely to ensure the rules are followed. Whereas less controlling parents, often called permissive parents, have fewer demands and allow their children a great deal of autonomy to explore, express opinions and emotions, and make decisions. And what it comes down to here is one of the things that's on the spectrum, on the permissive side, is parents who let their children have input on the rules. So the controlling side, the parents make the rules and the kids are expected to follow. The permissive side, if rules are present, and it's not always that no rules are present on the permissive side, but if rules are present, the children have input into the rules. Doesn't mean necessarily that the children make the rules. Parents still can make the rules, but the children might have input into, like, let's say, the punishment for a rule break. And that way the children have some control over what's going on. Within this spectrum of these demanding, controlling, so permissive on one side, restrictive on the other, And on the previous slide, we looked at acceptive responsiveness, so those high in acceptance and those low in acceptance. We get 4 parenting styles that come out of this. The first is authoritarian parenting. So this is a parenting style that is restrictive. So on the domains of control versus permissive, they have high demandingness control. And on the domain of acceptance responsiveness, they have low acceptance and responsiveness. So low responsiveness, low acceptance, high control. This is authoritarian. This type of parenting style is where parents impose many rules and expect strict obedience. They may not and rarely do explain why the rules are there, why the child should comply with them. They often rely on power tactics such as physical punishment to gain compliance, this type of thing. So again, authoritarian is a very strict parenting style. My way or the highway, that type of thing. And when I'm doing parenting styles, I actually like to use that 70s show as examples. So some of you might not have seen that 70s show. If not, I recommend going back and watching it. It's amusing. But we get to see all 4 parenting styles in that 70s show. So this parenting style, authoritarian, very strict, very my way or the highway. If you've watched the show, can you think of that's has this parenting style? That would be Red. Red has a very, you do what he says and there's no question. And if you don't do what he says, you'll get a boot in your ass. That type of thing. So it's very strict parenting. The next parenting style is authoritative. So authoritative parents, and I like to use the word, I like to point out how do you tell the difference between authoritative and authoritarian from the previous slide. One way I always say just to look at is this IVE at the end, this authoritative. I make that parallel to give and take, because authoritative parenting is that give and take style of parenting. They tend to be more flexible. They still have high demandingness, so they exert control. But they also have high acceptance and responsiveness. So whereas authoritarian was high control, low responsiveness, authoritative is high control, high responsiveness. So in this case, there's communication that goes about, and kind of what I was talking about there in kind of in the control side is they allow their kids to have input on the rules and punishments, things like that. So they set clear rules. They consistently enforce them, but they also explain the rationale for the rules and restrictions and are responsive to the children's needs and points of view, so they involve the children in things like family decision making. They're reasonable, democratic in their approach, but they are in charge. That's the big thing here. They are in charge. So really it does come down to, that's an important concept, is the parent's still in charge, but they've got that high accepting responsiveness, so they communicate respect for the children. This is, and we'll come back to it in just a bit, but this is universally looked at as the best parenting style. So it has a lot of research behind good outcomes for kids. Who do you know from that 70s show that had this parenting style? Well, that would be more of Kitty. So, and this also shows how 2 different parents of the same kids can have 2 different parenting styles. Red and Kitty are a couple. Red is authoritarian, Kitty is authoritative. And she communicates a lot with the kids. She's still in charge. She still expects them to follow the rules, but she's more communicative with them and more respectful of them. Third parenting style is permissive. So permissive is going to be high acceptance responsiveness, just like the last one, but low demanding control. So this is a parenting style basically associated with few rules and demands. So very permissive, very low demanding control. They encourage their children to express feelings, impulses, rarely exert control, and really what it comes down to here is parents with this style really try and be friends with their children first, and parents second, if at all. And you get a lot of behavioral problems that can come with this because the kids didn't have control when they were growing up. Back to that 70s show, who do we have with this? Midge and Bob. They both, I mean, Midge was always trying to be friends with Donna. She didn't want to be a mom, she wanted to be a friend. And Bob did it too, to an extent. So really, they were very permissive. Then we get the last one, neglectful. This one's really the bad one. Overall, all of them except authoritative have negatives, but neglectful is just really bad all the way around. So there's low demanding control and low acceptance responsiveness. Basically, these are parents who just are uninvolved. They don't seem to care about their children. They may be so overwhelmed with their own problems, maybe emotional problems, stuff like that, or even financial problems, that they can't devote energy to expressing love or setting and enforcing rules. And who do we know from that 70s show that was this? Well, if you have to dig deep for this one, but it's Hyde's mom. Hyde's mom was basically this type of parent. She wasn't around. She actually, I believe it was at the end of the first or second season, she just up and left for California. Just left Hyde home alone without enough to pay rent or anything, and took off. So very neglectful, very basically abusive in the neglectful way. Just an interesting side note, the person who played her was Peggy on Married with Children, all the way back a long time ago, but also was Leela on Futurama. Don't know why that term wouldn't come to me, but was Leela, the voice of Leela on Futurama. So just interesting ties there. But yeah, neglectful, very negative, very poor outcomes. We're not even going to talk about that on the effects of parenting style on the next slide, because it's just all around negative and bad. Okay, so let's look at some of the benefits and costs to these different styles. So the benefits of authoritarian is it may prevent some adolescent behavioral problems. The cost, though, is teens tend to be more withdrawn, confronting, and dependent. There is an argument for authoritarian parenting in low-income areas because they're basically training the kids to be employees. Most of the parents are employees of companies. They're training the kids to be obedient employees of companies, because most companies out there, especially with low-wage employees, are a very authoritarian type of work environment where the boss is the boss and there's no questioning the rules. So there's a sociology argument that authoritarian parenting is preparing kids to be employees in a work environment that is authoritarian. Authoritative, as I said before, has lots of benefits. It's generally believed to be the best parenting style. There's this loving, supportive interactions that occur. So authoritative has lots of benefits. The last is permissive. It does have the benefits of making fewer demands, and some teens come out good with these fewer demands. They become more independent, stuff like that. But on the other side, teens may be less mature, more socially assertive, and less achievement oriented if the parents are permissive. So now that we have talked about identity in adolescence, let's transition into self-concept, self-esteem, personality, all of that in adulthood. So one of the main things that does happen is self-esteem tends to rise gradually throughout the adult years up until about the mid-60s, and this is basically from that adolescence where it starts to typically decline in most, that after late adolescence into early adulthood, when you're starting to get a job, form a family, have kids, this is when self-esteem tends to rise. But then for some adults into the 70s and 80s, it does decline some. Why do these self-conceptions and the self-esteem change? Well, one of the big things is there is a reduction in the gap between the ideal self and the real self. Talked about this a little bit before in how in children there's this really big gap between the ideal self and the real self, where they believe that they can be astronauts, NFL players, all of that, and their actual self is different, and that the gap between the ideal self and the real self declines throughout adolescence, but into adulthood it continues to decline. So those in later adulthood basically have no difference between the ideal self and the real self. Another thing is goals are adjusted. So early on in life, you tend to have grand goals, big goals. As you make these goals more realistic, more achievable, they become, as a result, more achievable, and then you have better self-concept and better self-esteem as a result. So along those lines, these standards of self-evaluation, when we evaluate ourselves, we tend to be overly critical when we're younger, and as we get older, our evaluations of the self become more realistic and less critical. The next part is comparing the self to other people. So I mentioned in childhood and in adolescence, we compare ourselves to others, and how when we compare ourselves to others, we've got this big gap. We tend to compare ourselves to the people around us that are better than we are, or even to those in the media, to athletes, to movie stars, to actresses, to actors. We compare ourselves to people that are so much above and beyond where we are that we quite often have problems with self-esteem as a result. Well, one of the things that's been found is that older adults actually compare themselves to even older adults. They don't compare themselves as much to people that are the same age as them or younger than them. They'll compare themselves to people who are older than they are, and as a result, they are comparing themselves to people who are slightly more worse off, maybe have worse health, worse prospects, things like that, and as a result, they tend to have a higher self-esteem. The final one is not internalizing ageist stereotypes. So that is one of the issues is in our society and in many societies, we have stereotypes against those who are older. Well, those who are actually older, who internalize these stereotypes, actually have a harder time and worse self-esteem. Those people that are older that don't internalize them, that ignore those stereotypes, the stereotype that people that are older have to be less physically fit, and those people, or those that are older, have cognitive declines, those types of stereotypes. The people that don't acknowledge those stereotypes actually tend to do better. Another component is the broader cultural context. So I talked about this just a little bit ago when we were talking about adolescence and how we form identity. Well, self-concept also relates to this broader cultural context. One of the main differences here when we talk about culture, one of the biggest things we look at when we're looking at differences between cultures is individualistic versus collectivistic. So in individualistic cultures, people tend to be more about the self, more about independence, more about getting away from the group, not necessarily to be out of the group, but to be more head and shoulders above the rest, to stand out. That's one of the things in individualistic cultures that is prized. Whereas in collectivistic cultures, it is more about the group and being a member of the group. So China is a very big collectivistic culture. I had a Chinese roommate once, and one of the things he always told me was, one of the big things that's a saying that they follow is, the nail that sticks out gets the hammer. Meaning if you stand out above the group, if you get recognition beyond the group, you tend to get knocked down to the rest of the group, because the group is what is important, not the individual. So when we're talking about self-concept in individualistic cultures, because people define themselves primarily as an individual, their self-concept becomes in alignment with that individuality, with their belief or their philosophy that they themselves are what's important. Whereas in the collectivistic cultures, and again, people define themselves as part of the group, then their self-concept will become the group. Their self-concept will incorporate the goals of the group rather than their personal goals. Okay, for the last few slides here, we're just going to talk about some of the aging process and kind of looking at death and dying very briefly. I'm not a big fan of talking about it, even developmental, I don't talk about it that much, but it is the end of development, so we do have to look at it very briefly. So when we look at aging, the aging process, basically what's going on is there's a bunch of different things in the body going on. You have things like free radicals that are toxic molecules that are building up. You have random damage to body organs and DNA, and we also have what's called the Hayflick limit, which is the amount of time cells can reproduce, can divide, and that's related to the telomeres. I'm not going to test you on this or anything, but the telomeres, which are on the end of the chromosomes, and basically when a cell divides, the telomeres get shorter. So as cells divide over and over and over again, the telomeres are eventually used up, and some of the chromosome starts getting pulled apart on when cells divide. All of this causes damage to the body, and eventually this damage exceeds the body's ability to repair itself, and resulting in greater susceptibility to various different diseases, including cancer and death. As far as cognitive changes going on in later life, we get basically from 20 to 40, cognitive skills remain relatively stable. 40 to 80, there is some cognitive decline, but I should point out that if you're interested in more of this, either take a cognitive class or a developmental class, because what we actually know is that this is actually dependent on your profession, the type of cognitive process we're talking about, as well as a use it or lose it. So the late 50s, slowing in processing speed, perceptual speed, and reaction time, and knowledge and vocabulary remain level or even increase. But all of this is really, it comes back to this use it or lose it. So we've got changes in memory in the 40s and continuing into old age. Many people complain about not remembering things. When we talk about cognition and memory, we'll look at this a little bit more, but one thing that I just keep coming back to, use it or lose it. I can't emphasize that enough. It's one of the biggest things we know about psychology with aging and cognition. And even this works with physical as well. So the mind works the same way as the physical body does. That is, if you become sedentary, let's say you're a weightlifter. Let's talk about physical first. Let's say you're a weightlifter. You've got all this muscle. Then you become sedentary. You just sit on the couch all day. You don't move much. What's going to happen is you're going to lose your muscle mass. Your muscles are going to go down. You might gain fat, but that's even besides the point to the fact that you're going to have diminished muscles. It's going to go down. That is because it's commonly accepted and acknowledged that when we're talking about muscle, we're talking about the fact that if you do not continue to use it, to maintain it, then you're going to lose it. The mind works the same way. That is that if you, let's say you were working a job as an engineer, and your whole life you've been working as an engineer, you've been using your mind, you've been using it, you've stayed sharp, and then you reach retirement and you just start sitting in front of the TV watching the TV mindlessly. And one thing we know about most television is it's pretty mindless. It doesn't require much cognitive effort. We're not talking, like video games requires cognitive effort. Reading requires cognitive effort. Doing things like puzzles requires cognitive effort. Watching TV doesn't require that much cognitive effort. So if you've been an engineer your whole life, you retire and you just sit in front of the TV now, you're going to have cognitive decline. It's going to happen. It's a use it or lose it. You got to continue to use your mind or you're going to have cognitive decline. There are some things that circumvent that. Things like Alzheimer's, which no matter how much you use it, you're still going to have decline. But actually, what we know is that those who use their mind more stave off the effects of Alzheimer's for a time. It doesn't stop it, and in the long term, it ends up the same. But people who are using their mind, they really don't start to show the signs of Alzheimer's until we look at the later stages. So that's the one thing I will emphasize, and we'll talk about it again when we talk about cognitive. I can't emphasize this enough in people. Use your mind or you're going to have cognitive decline. And if you've got parents, grandparents, people you know that are older, that are basically just sitting around doing nothing, and they're wondering why their mind's going, well, that's part of it. Again, can't guarantee, because there are diseases, disorders that can circumvent that, can get around it, but for most people, for the average person, your mind is a use it or lose it. Okay, next slides, we'll just really quick talk about menopause. Since we talked about puberty, we have to talk about menopause, basically the other end of the reproductive years. Puberty starts the reproductive years, menopause ends them for women. The average age is around 50, but it can start in some women as early as 35, and about 60 at the latest it can go to. And what is going on here is estrogen is being reduced in the body, results in cessation of ovulation in the menstrual cycle. Some physical symptoms that can come about are hot flashes, sleep disturbances. Psychological symptoms are things like moodiness, depression, anxiety, anger. But what is basically happening here is it's the end of the reproductive age. Humans are one of the few species out there that have a menopause. There's actually a couple others that have a type of menopause. Humans are the only ones that have a true menopause. But really, why do we have that then? Evolutionary terms. You know, I love my evolution. Evolutionary terms. We look at it in the context of women who are older. If they have a child, since humans require a lot of care for many years, at least 12 to 13 years of care, and in many societies 15, 18, even longer, more years of care, but let's say it's on average about 15 years of care. Well, if women are having a child and then dying within the next 15 years on average, then they're not giving that child enough care to reach adulthood. So it is not to their benefit to an evolutionary benefit to women to have kids within 10 to 15 years of their average life expectancy. Now, we're in an environmental mismatch now where people are living into their 80s, 90s, 100, beyond, whereas the average lifespan for most of evolutionary history for women would be right around 50. So, and even 50, 60, even in that range, you're looking at the fact that the kids born towards the end are going to struggle. And we also have the grandparent effect in humans, because we're more of a social species, whereas grandparents can now invest in their grandchildren so they don't have to have more offspring of their own. So there's a double whammy there for evolutionary reasons for menopause to occur. Why doesn't it happen in men? Well, men don't typically do the majority of the raising of offspring, so there isn't the same selective pressures on men as there is on women to cease reproduction. There's actually some advantages to older men having children, but if you're interested in more of that, I recommend Human Sexuality. Talk about that in much more detail. Last thing I want to just look at here is death and dying. And like I said, I don't even really like talking about this, so I don't even spend too much time on it in developmental. So we'll just look at it here just really briefly, and that is we have what's called the Kubler-Ross stages of dying, or stages of, not necessarily dying, stages of grief that go into, some of it is relating to death of loved ones, some of it is relating to maybe projected death of yourself, that type of thing. I will say that there is a lot of evidence that the Kubler-Ross isn't exactly accurate. One of the biggest criticisms of it is it's not cross-culturally consistent. Some cultures, people don't go through all these stages. Some cultures, people go through them in different orders, that type of thing. But it is a general way we can look at death and dying, even if it's not necessarily supported by all the research. And that is, people go through these stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And again, this is along the lines of grief, if you lose a loved one, or the pending death of yourself. You tend to go through these stages, at least, if not necessarily exactly these stages, we tend to go through a process similar to these stages, but it is individual specific. Just a quick tangent. I always love to tell this tangent when talking about the Kubler-Ross stages. I did a lot of bar trivia when I was in grad school, and I did bar trivia with other grad students. We had a group of psychology grad students, so we're all getting our PhDs in psychology. One of the questions was about the Kubler-Ross stages, and we listed the stages in the order that modern researchers look at the stages, which is not the same as this. We listed those as the order as our answer for the trivia question and ended up getting it wrong. So yeah, a question, a psychology question specific, a group of PhD students got wrong, but mainly because we gave an answer that was more modern rather than this classical 5-stage you see here. So it's just interesting thing to look at, and just interesting tangent to kind of lighten the mood when talking about death and dying. Okay, so in this set of slides, we talked about puberty and physical development, we talked about cognitive emotional development, looked at morality, looked at identity, looked at the parenting styles, and finally aging, and then finished up with a little bit on death and dying. With this, you should be able to, with this we are done with the discussion on developmental, and next we'll get to the next topics. Thanks, come on back.